before we kind of get into Mark in particular, I want to talk a little bit about why we have Gospels at all, which might at first seem like an odd question because we're so used to having Gospels, we read from them all the time. But it's actually kind of a new genre, not only in Christian literature, but in world literature. And if you look at the earliest writings of the Christian community, they come from the Apostle Paul, who's writing letters to churches that he founded and then had to move on and continues his relationship with them by correspondence. And one of the things that's kind of interesting about Paul is that his letters are almost entirely devoid of any information about Jesus, about his life, about his ministry, about his teaching, miracles. There's next to nothing there. There's no biographical information. There's no stories of his birth. All Paul is interested in is Jesus' death and resurrection. And we think they came about for a couple of reasons. I'm going to list four briefly. The first is that, again, when you're reading Paul, the earliest Christian writer, you have a clear sense of Paul's own anticipation that Jesus will be coming back, and coming back very quickly, very soon. And Paul's probably writing in the 50s, between 50 and 60, give or take a little bit, so about 20 years after the ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And in Paul's ministry, there's a constant kind of expectation that Jesus will be coming back at any moment. So not only does he not have any interest in the historical Jesus, but he doesn't have time to research that data either because he's so consumed by proclaiming the gospel in the time that's allowed. The Gospels are written in the 70s and 80s, and Mark, probably the earliest, is written somewhere around or just after 70 AD, so another 20 years after Paul. And by this time, the church has recognized that Jesus hasn't come back yet, or as quickly as people expected, and may not be coming back in the immediate future. And that's a huge change in the imagination and consciousness of the church. And so early Christian communities are now, they're recognizing that they're going to be here for the long haul. And for that reason, they begin to think a little bit more and more deeply about their origins and their story. So that's reason number one. Jesus didn't come back as quickly, and the Gospels are an attempt to make sense of Jesus' story in light of that. Second thing is that if you can imagine the Gospels being written about 40 years after Jesus' ministry, then it's probably not surprising that many of the eyewitnesses, many of the original disciples and apostles and people who knew Jesus firsthand are beginning to die. And if you think about the tremendous interest in the recollections of our own World War II veterans about 10 years ago, as we got to the 40th and then 50th anniversary of D-Day, and the rest, there was this profound recognition that this generation, the greatest generation, was soon to pass. And so there are all kind of documentaries and oral histories. We wanted to capture their testimony. And something very similar is going on in the Christian community. As more and more of the original eyewitnesses die, there's this tremendous interest in capturing those recollections and preserving them. Third reason is that by this time there are a lot of stories of Jesus circulating around. And the communities that are forming around this story need to sort them out. And so there's an interest in laying some order to them. In fact, when Luke starts his gospel, he'll say, you've no doubt heard many people try to offer an orderly account of Jesus' life. That's what I'm going to do too. And before Luke does it, Mark's doing the same. So he's taking different traditions, parables, miracle stories, about Jesus and crafting them, shaping them into an orderly story that will help his community. Fourth reason then stems from that is that this is the time in the 70s and 80s of major upheaval in the early Christian communities, and that's particularly true of Mark, because the world is changing, and particularly the world of Judaism is changing as the destruction of the temple. Israel's caught up in about an 8-year war with the Romans, and at the culmination of that war, the Jerusalem temple is destroyed. And that not only affects Jews of the first century, it affects Christians, most of whom themselves are Jews or were connected to the Jewish church. And so in light of this massive upheaval, there are tons of questions about is this the end of the world? And does this mean that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah? Or does this free us to witness to the whole world, or what's going on? And so each of the Gospels is written to a particular time and place to address some of those questions.